And for all the people listening, I want to look right in the camera. Where is it? Oh, I'm stuck in Zoom world. It's right here. I want to make this very, very clear. All data science is political.
Yes, I will do that. You ready, everybody? We'll see if I can do this in one take. Sometimes I can, sometimes I can't. You know, it depends on the day. Okay. Today we are joined by James Mickens. James is the Gordon McKay Professor of Computer Science at Harvard's John A. Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, as well as a director at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Welcome, James. We're very excited to talk to you today.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction.
Good to see you again, James. Glad you could join us. So let's get started. I want to talk specifically first about people in technology and actually the people who create technology. The people who create technology are in a unique position to sort of know when bias might be introduced. Do you have a sense of, like what proportion of those people actually aware that they have this big responsibility?
I can't give you a specific number. I know that the number is lower than we would hope. I think that a lot of people come through their technical education, whether it be formal through university or whether it be sort of informal through, self-teaching, watching courses on the internet. But a lot of technologists, and in fact, a lot of sort of tech-centered entrepreneurs, they come through that sort of educational process thinking that, implicitly that technology is value neutral, that somehow, we just create these products. And sure, they can be used for good or bad, but ultimately that's not for, the technologist or for the business person to decide. There's some sort of hope, if it gets too bad, maybe the government will intervene or, social forces will take over, there'll be boycotts, but, it's not our problem. But that's wrong. That's the wrong way to think about it. And so I think that the fraction of people who actively devote thought to this, it's getting bigger. So that's the good news, right? I think that particularly the younger generation of entrepreneurs and tech folks, they are starting to think about these things more explicitly, but there's still a large swath of the sort of tech community that would sort of prefer to not get bogged down in these quote unquote non-technical details.
It's an interesting observation, given that maybe it says something about our community. We reached out on Twitter with a poll before interviewing you and asked, if a developer sees something that really should be dealt with at the time, or there's a heavy bias in a product, the poll was, should they always say something? Should they only say if they think it's a really big deal, or is it not their problem? And it was pretty universal that they should always say something. So maybe that says something about our community, but or maybe the trend led in the right direction. So it's actually,
yeah, or maybe
nice
we can't necessarily trust the polls. It's the same sense in we would all say we would help, the grandmother try to cross the street. We would certainly do that. But of course, when we actually get to the intersection, you see everyone looking around saying, who else is going to help this person across the street? I got somewhere to go, And so I think that you're exactly right that in the abstract, when you ask people these questions, they say, oh, of course. Oh, of course, we should think about, the well-being of other people when doing this, that, and the other. But, once you get the pressure of deadlines, the product has to ship next week. Once you get the pressure of shareholders, they want to make sure that you're competitive, where competitive is oftentimes defined as how many features do you have, how fast is your software, so on and so forth. When you start looking at these sort of more complex real world situations, I think it's easier for people to lose some of their moral centering, if you will.
I kind of wanted to follow up on that theme around the way that we sort of bifurcate or silo, right? There's technical issues and questions and problems, and then, call them social, right? And it goes both ways, right? We just don't traverse that boundary a lot. But so it seems to me what you're saying about education is really critical, right? If we educate people differently so that these ethical considerations are embedded in how they think from the get-go, that seems ideal. But of course, we're at a place today where there's plenty of people, in positions of power making decisions that didn't have that education. So, and you had this great quote in a talk that I was watching in preparation from this interview. I think you said something like, it's pointed out, its ethical considerations become less important to us when considering them what could hurt our revenue, right? Or some other, and you mentioned that earlier, right? Deadlines, right? We just have these different incentives So I would be curious sort of to hear you talk about where we are today. How do we meaningfully integrate these ethical considerations into our decision making, and how do we even communicate about them when there's so much variation in sort of what people know on both the social and the technical sides?
Right. Those are great questions. I think the sort of first step is always realizing that you have a problem. Right. So in other words, the first step is always sort of stepping back and saying, look, I can't just silo myself in my narrow sort of domain of expertise. The things that I build, the companies, the technology, the people that I train, they interact with the larger society. So I think just sort of getting that high level idea in people's heads, that's sort of the first fight. Then after you sort of, won that battle, I think the next sort of struggle is to convince people that many of these sort of, ethical challenges, they don't just have a very simple yes, no answer. And of course, as engineers, that is what we want to hear. So as engineers, we want to basically say, look, I get it, ethics, certainly I want to make sure that I don't go to jail and I get to heaven. So can you just give me a checklist? Can you just give me a checklist? And then whenever something ethical happens to me, where I have to make some type of ethical decision, I just consult, ye old checklist. And then I just go, yep, okay, boom, then we're done. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, this is not the way that these situations actually resolve themselves in the real world. You actually have to think about these things, and you have to, make difficult decisions whereby the decision you end up making may still have some bad effects. It may be the best of a series of difficult decisions to make. So that's where I think it's actually helpful to have people either on staff or people that you can sort of talk to who are sort of classically trained in thinking about these difficult issues. Many hospitals, for example, have an ethics board, right? And it's not because the doctors aren't aware of these issues. It's that the doctors were first and foremost trained to, heal people. They weren't trained to think about, philosophers in caves, whatever it was that was obsessing, the Greeks back in the day. So I think that, increasingly, in at least some of the bigger companies, you're starting to see there be some roles inside the company where the job is to think about some of these issues. In the same way that you have sort of a lawyer to think about legal compliance, you might have some philosophers, some ethicists, some sociologists on staff to think about these issues of what is the right and wrong thing to do here? Who are the stakeholders? Are we ensuring that we're providing equity along multiple dimensions? Gender, race, disability status, things like that. So I think that's ultimately sort of where we want to go. The end game is that, even if you have a company that seemingly is only focused on one thing, making trades go fast or providing a social network or things like that, they still have the capacity to think more holistically about how those products are integrating with the rest of society.
There's a lot of talk about bias in data, but there's a lot of steps in data. There's the data gathering, there's the collection, the storage, the parsing of it, then there's the analyzing of it. Then on the back end, there's, systems of AI and ML, interpreting them and making decisions or projecting the future. I wonder, are there different problems at each stage there? And are some of the problems bigger than others? And where do you see a biggest problem, or is everyone just got to be aware all along?
Yeah, it's wall-to-wall problems, chock full of problems. Christmas has come early and your gifts are problems. That's the way that I would look at it. I mean, I think that, intuitively, I think the sort of human nature is to look at problems and try to be, as reductionist as possible, and to say, I've got this complicated process. But here's the problem. Here's the problem. We want to point fingers at something and say, if we fix that, then we're done. I think that, particularly when you look at, sort of big data pipelines, machine learning, things like that, because these pipelines are oftentimes so deep, because the data sets are so complex and so multidimensional, it's oftentimes hard to say, if we just fix this one thing, that'll solve 90% of our quote unquote, ethics problems or our quote unquote diversity problems or whatnot. It's typically a more holistic type of reasoning that you have to apply. And I think that this, is somewhat related to our conversation from a while ago about, there is no checklist, right? In as much as if you do this, this, and this, then you're scot-free. Instead, what it typically, it's lifestyle, so you have to, at every step of sort of design and then implementation and then testing, you have to be thinking about some of these questions. And, one pushback that you'll sometimes get from that, particularly from, engineers or from quants or people like that who view themselves as like being hard technical people, they'll say, this isn't what you hired me for. You didn't hire me to sort of, watch these videos about the value of diversity. I believe it. Let everyone in, but I don't want to talk about this. And the problem is that there's a lot of research which shows that that type of attitude, I understand bias, but I just don't want to deal with it, sort of my day-to-day sort of professional life. That does not lead to unbiased outcomes, right? It's a thing that you always have to sort of think about, in addition to the, the technical side of things or to the business side of things. So it's really, to get back to sort of your original question, you've got some, big data pipeline that involves a lot of different players, that involves a lot of different systems. At every step, you have to think about, who are the stakeholders? Who are the people you're trying to help? What are their interests? How do you make sure those interests are being protected? Who are the set of people that you don't care about, right? Who are the set of people for whom you're not actually targeting their concerns? Being explicit about that stuff is very important, because when you don't think about it explicitly, you end up getting sort of tech that sort of fails in these ways that end up causing a lot of harm, even though, let's say, the developers and the business folks don't have any explicit malice in their heart. A great example is like a facial recognition for cameras built into laptops. A lot of the early sort of cameras that came out, they couldn't track people's faces of a certain skin tone. And I have no doubt that the people who designed a lot of these early systems, they weren't explicitly trying to do that. But they didn't ask these questions about, where's our training data coming from, for example. So they get training data that itself is biased. It then results in a biased, sort of facial recognition algorithm. They didn't know that, though. And so they just shipped the product saying, we've hit all of our internal metrics for accuracy. But it was, it wasn't until people started posting things on YouTube where, you'd have someone come into frame and then the camera would just freak out, and just start, emitting smoke. It took that to make them understand, like, we really need to rethink our process, from the ground up, not just sort of the engineering and the algorithms once you have the data, but where is that data coming from in the first place?
We're talking a lot about engineers thinking differently. What's the space or need for people who are non-engineers, and what's their role? And interesting enough, what would they have to be doing differently? Do we just take ethicists and put them in a room with engineers, or do they need to learn something first? What's your view on that?
Exactly. Yeah. My number one recommendation, you take the ethicist, chain them to a radiator, bring in the other set of people, chain them to a radiator, see who makes it out. My bet's on the ethicist. They're kind, but they're kind. I would say that, once again, if you look at any sort of, modern enterprise, there's a very good chance that the set of job titles that you have at that enterprise are pretty varied. Even at, let's say, I'm just making this example up, but even in a tech company, they have a huge number of lawyers. They have a huge number of business people and economists. These are very diverse companies. And so what that means is that even if you think that, oh, I work at a widget company, the majority of people who work at this company are directly making widgets. That's oftentimes false. They're sort of in these support roles to support the, widget forward workers. You can tell I'm not a business person. That's not business talk. Anyways, so I think that, what ends up happening a lot of times is that there are these decisions about, products and services that have to be made that don't just involve the sort of people on the ground, the people who are actually making those services or products. And the decisions oftentimes bubble up to other parts of the company, which are, not those front-facing people, either the lawyers, the HR people, things like that. And so I think that when you talk about things like, diversity training, when you talk about things like, sort of ethics training, it's not just sort of teaching that you want to do to the people who are frontline making the widgets. It's all the way up and down the stack. And to be honest, I think a lot of the training also has to be directed to shareholders as well. Because I think another sort of like key tension that oftentimes arises is that people, by people I mean shareholders, say things like, well, yeah, all these things that you're doing that are not directly profit focused, great, we should definitely do that, but also don't hurt profit. They sort of want to have this sort of ambivalence towards these things, and that ambivalence is it's problematic.
So you do a lot of research on cybersecurity, and it seems like that's an area where we're just beginning to grapple with the implications of that topic around on diversity, inclusion, justice, fairness. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about the connections between cybersecurity and equity.
Sure. So I think that you know, all of these issues that we look at in technology, and I think increasingly in business too, I think just defining these terms is becoming messier and messier. Like it's becoming more and more difficult. So going back to this example of facial recognition. So imagine that you have cities. I mean, we don't have to imagine this. There are cities who have cameras deployed throughout the streets. And those cameras are used, among other things, to help, you know, prevent and then later on sort of unravel what type of criminal activity happened. Well, if the data that was used to train those cameras to identify faces was biased, that puts certain communities at greater risk. And so there's an interesting cybersecurity angle there too, because if someone were to break into those systems and let's say change the way that they identified criminals versus not criminals, that risk would fall disproportionately on certain segments of society. To put a finer point on it, you know, depending on what zip code you live in, right? You are more or less likely to have, let's say, you know, police cameras in that zip code. And as a result, like the security or lack thereof of that camera, of a camera system deployed by the city, you know, the impact of that system being hacked into will fall disproportionately on people from different zip codes. So I think that, you know, this notion of cybersecurity, as it's evolving, as I said, it used to just be, can people break into my stuff? It's become more encompassing as technology has become more pervasive. So now, for example, cybersecurity includes things like, can people break into my power grid? By my, I mean like, you know, a county, a state, a nation. Cybersecurity includes things like, can someone tamper with our elections? And once again, you know, there are opportunities for disproportionate impact in terms of the way that, you know, let's say foreign nation states might try to tamper with the votes that have been registered by certain members of certain communities. So, you know, once again, I think this all harkens back to this idea that when we talk about these issues of tech or business or cybersecurity or, you know, bias or diversity or ethics, you really have to take this increasingly broader perspective on things, because so many aspects of society are intertangled now with so many other aspects of society.
Yeah, that brings up the point I always wonder about integrating these data sets. So you mentioned certain zip codes have more data or more gathered information on the residents in those areas. And out there, there are companies like, for instance, financial institutions that want to evaluate people for loans. And they're aggregating data from many, many sources. So inherently, it would seem there'd be more information about people and potential crime or crime in certain zip codes. And if the financial institutions just take that data at face value, they may make interpretations, because then that's another thing. Someone has to decide, you know, how do I aggregate all this data together and decide a profile of who you are? And then there's implications further beyond just the criminal justice system. And is this aggregation of data, I mean, does anyone, how many people are looking at that and what are they seeing?
It's a real problem what you just described. And for all the people listening, I want to look right in the camera. Where is it? Oh, I'm stuck in Zoom world. It's right here. I want to make this very, very clear. All data science is political. Okay? Like it's impossible to take a data set and analyze it in a quote unquote perfectly objective way, because you're always going to be putting on there some type of value judgment about what the data set represents, whether that data set covers all the attributes that you care about, and what are you trying to do with the data set? You know, and I think that once again, it's very easy for technologists and entrepreneurs to say, let the machines handle it because it's just zeros and ones. But that's not at all the way that this sort of system works. You know, so when you look at things, for example, like you know, predicting whether someone's going to default on a loan, for example, maybe to give them a mortgage or something like that. You know, let's say I give you some data set which looks at the historical rate of loan defaults for, you know, a bunch of different people. Put that in scare quotes intentionally. First of all, which communities are you looking at? You know, were they already the target of, let's say, previous predatory lending, which put them in a poor position to pay forward new loans? Things like that. thinking about those questions and whether those questions are important, that is a political process. And by political, I don't mean political in the sense of like, you're like a capital R Republican, capital D Democrat. I mean political in the sense that you are making a statement about what you would prefer the world to look like, given that you're going to analyze data in a certain way. That's what I mean by political, right? And so, I think it's so important for people to understand that, because so often you hear this attitude of, yeah, we have these humans making these decisions, and of course humans are biased. But once we feed it into this machine learning thing, once we feed into this algorithm, all of our bias problems go away. And that's just completely false, and what you end up seeing time and time again is that if you don't ask these political questions, you're not honest about that kind of stuff, then you see the old biases that you were supposedly trying to get rid of being replicated in these new systems that you create. But except now that you have this sort of facade of like, oh, it's just zeros and ones, So when I see, when I hear about things like, oh, we're going to use, algorithms to determine the first pass of CV screening. So you submit an application, and then an algorithm basically says, here's the first cut of things. That concerns me, because there's many studies that show, for example, if you have two resumes that are exactly the same, and you just change the name, all kinds of like bad things happen based on whether you change the name to a woman or a person of color sounding name, so on and so forth. And so if you say, oh, the goal of our algorithm is to be just as accurate as our old system, but your old system wasn't accurate, So I think it's really important for everyone listening, whenever, if you're at a company and like your CTO or some data scientist says, don't worry, we got an algorithm on the case, we're not going to have any bias problems. Fire that person, arguably make a citizen's arrest. Look up, be knowledgeable of the statutes. Try to, just do something to them till the authorities can show up, because that's just a terrible way of thinking about things.
So this is a question that I was thinking about, watching some presentations you've given, and then also reading how you talk about teaching, right? Because you're an educator, you're not just a researcher, and you're clearly a communicator, and you're somebody who cares a lot about trying to foster these conversations, right? So we can address some of the things that you're calling out and you're identifying as, I think you called it wall-to-wall problems, which is a great turn of phrase that I will be using in my own life. And I think anybody who knows much about you knows that you really lean into humor, right? And also kind of storytelling and narrative in these public talks, and I imagine maybe in the classroom too. So I would just love to hear you talk about why you do that, why you think that's useful, because I imagine that it's a deliberate choice that you're making.
Yeah, I mean, heavy is the crown. Sometimes I wake up and just have too many jokes in my mind, and it's difficult to find a way to share that gift with humanity. And yet I try, So I think that one reason I try to incorporate sort of storytelling and humor into my sort of public speaking is that you hear from politicians and leaders all the time, we need more people in tech. Think more about tech. Tech is a great thing to get into. Science and math and engineering and studying, blah, blah. And yet we don't have as many popularizers of, STEM subjects as one might expect, given all these exhortations to go into that field. And I think that it's very easy for lay people to get this impression that, oh, STEM stuff is very stodgy, and, I'm just going to be locked away in a lab all day, and it's not fun. But I think it isn't, in fact, fun. I think it is, in fact, interesting. And furthermore, it is, in fact, important. Many of the issues we've talked about in this conversation are issues that are extremely important to large swaths of society. And I think that because of this latter issue in particular, that there are so many important issues which, need to be talked about, but which can be uncomfortable to talk about. That's one reason why I think humor can be very useful. Because I know, from personal experience teaching engineers, also, being an engineer myself, sometimes there's this reaction when someone comes to you and they're like, hey, have you thought about this, this thorny ethical dilemma? You're just like, get off my lawn. I don't want to hear about this kind of stuff. You couldn't come into my chair and write as many lines of bug-free code as I could. So just get out of here. And that misses the point. It misses the point about what it means to be like, a member of society, where you have to care more about things beyond just your narrow worldview. But sometimes you have to lead people sort of to that river so they can drink like a horse, or whatever that saying is, right? And so what I find is that if you sort of bring up some of these issues using sort of the delivery mechanism of humor, people will, they're more likely to sort of be less defensive when you start talking about the more difficult things. Because, no one likes to be told, for example, that they're biased. And I mean, anyone out there who's listening, take an implicit bias test. You will find out that you are basically like one bad day away from like living in the 1500s. Like, I mean, it is rough. It doesn't matter how like open-minded you think you are. You'll take the test and like, you'll be like, I've probably got a 95 out of 100. You'll get like a negative 18 out of 100. Like, I guarantee that. I've never seen a score higher than -5. Right. And so I think that's tough. It's tough for people to hear that message. And so that's why I think it's helpful to use comedy to sort of soften some of those blows and to tell personal stories. It's like I grew up in the South, and, I had a certain set of experiences there, which, some of them were troubling, in a certain sense. But it's useful to share some of those stories, because ultimately, we're all people. I mean, I don't want to tear up on camera, but, we're all people. There are a set of these universal experiences that we all have. And I think that people realize that quicker through laughing. Because when you laugh together, what is comedy, right? It's very interesting. Not to get too philosophical here, but, comedy, when you tell a joke, right, you've built a worldview, and you're asking people to join you in that worldview, to join you in this little universe that you've created, and then find the same things that you find funny. You want them to find that funny themselves. And in a certain sense, that's what any teaching is. That's what any advocacy is. It's you're saying, I've built this universe, this way of thinking about things, and I'm inviting you to come live in that universe. And so that's why I think it's so important that, we get these messages out there and we deliver them in a way that is both honest, but also sort of caring, kind of that makes it clear that, we all make mistakes, but if you're trying to constantly learn and you're trying to constantly think about these issues explicitly, then that's the best that we can do. And that's the most you could ever ask of someone.
I think it's working, by the way, just feedback for you.
I agree. No, that's great. The only thing I wanted to say is what you're saying about humor and kind of storytelling, right, as a way to bring people into a place where they feel like they're part of a community, like they're doing something together, and there's, kind of a shared experience and shared sense. I mean, I think it really, concurs with research that's been done on bias training, which has found that if you just educate people about bias and just that's it, like just, explain implicit bias to them and they get it and they know it's real and they know everyone has these implicit biases, it actually makes people ultimately behave in more biased ways. And the only way to avoid that is to frame it around, we're all trying to overcome these biases. And so I think that's kind of what you're doing in a different way, is creating that kind of condition around, we're all trying to kind of learn together and, grow and overcome this, rather than just, take the test and, oh my gosh, yes, it's, it's the Middle Ages and, everything is terrible. So I just wanted to say, I think there's some really, there's, research out there, I think, that really supports that approach. As well as anecdotally, I agree with Dave. I think it's working.
Yeah, for the viewers out there, I saved Dave from a life of crime many times, and now, he's all cleaned up. It's just been really, really heartwarming to see. So don't give up hope out there, kids.
It's a heartwarming story. We'll tell that story in another episode. It'll be like a prequel to this interview.
So before we close, is there anything that we haven't asked you, or anything that you haven't had a chance to speak to that is important that you want to leave people with? And if not, any resources or kind of other places you want to point people to go to learn more, who are interested in these topics.
I think that, and this is kind of building upon something that I mentioned a bit tangentially earlier, but I think one of the most important things anyone can do, regardless of, what their job is, what profession they're in, is talk to people. Because I feel that like a lot of, sort of frictions or issues or problems that arise, they arise because, people just haven't been exposed to certain ideas or certain perspectives. So, one thing I'd really recommend that people do is that they try to talk to their coworkers, talk to their neighbors, talk to their friends, and just listen and see what kind of issues are top of mind for those people. Because I feel like many of the, if we look specifically at this problem of, tech that's sort of gone awry, tech that, didn't serve the population the way that we thought it would, many of the issues that arise were foreseeable. They could have been dealt with early on if only we had sort of talked to and valued the opinions of other people who in many cases are not far away. It's not like you need to, put in a telegram to someone living at the center of the earth. you just need to just go talk to the person in your next cubicle or just, down the street. So that's one thing I'd really encourage people to do. I'd also say that if you are interested in sort of some more sort of formal training for these types of things, there are, and by these types of things, I mean things like, ethical reasoning, diversity training, things like that. If you're currently a student or you know anyone who is at a university, oftentimes universities offer sort of resources to help with these types of things. If you're particularly interested in issues at the intersection of computer science and ethics, you can check out Harvard's website for embedded ethics. That's publicly available. You can see some of the readings that we have there that technologists can look at. But yeah, really my high-level piece of advice is just talk to people, try to think about these issues involving business and tech and ethics holistically, and I think you'll see better outcomes.
Great, I think that's perfect. Note 10.
Yes. So, back when we talked about cybersecurity, Colleen, I was going to say, this conversation can go in two directions because James has mentioned bias in very specific places that aren't necessarily just tied to, all the things we were talking about. And then he mentioned presidents. So I was thinking the conversation could have gone either way, but I'm glad the way we went. Just,
Just for everyone's blood pressure.
Just for everyone's, yeah.
Hey, look, man, if you've got sizzle reel, I can take it to MSNBC. I'm looking for some side money. So
we're happy to help with that.
That's a wrap on the interview, but the conversation continues.
And we want to hear from you. Send your comments, questions, and ideas to justdigital.hbs.edu.
You've been watching Pathways to a Just Digital Future,
an investigative project that aims to better understand and address inequality in tech.
This program was produced by the Harvard Business School Digital and Gender Initiatives.
Our team includes
Ethiopia Omari and my cat.
Tanya Flynn.
One more time. Liz Sarli.
Thomas Jamie-dayo.
I'm Dave Homa.
And I'm Colleen Ammerman.
Thanks for hanging out with us.
Keep exploring at justdigital.hbs.edu.